What do you do when you realize the man you've been ignoring is a living legend? When the janitor you barely noticed turns out to be one of America's greatest heroes? The cadets at West Point were about to find out, because the keys that fell from his belt that morning didn't just unlock doors. They unlocked a story of courage, sacrifice, and dignity that would change how every person in that academy saw the quiet man who had been walking among them in silence for 3 long years. Welcome to Daily Soldier Stories. Before we continue this powerful story of hidden honor and unexpected revelation, tell me in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. The cadets at West Point called him Pops, not out of respect, but because they didn't know his real name. Henry Patterson had been mopping their floors, cleaning their bathrooms, and emptying their trash for 3 years. Never spoke unless spoken to. Never made eye contact. Just an old man in gray coveralls who seemed grateful to have any job at all. He arrived every morning at 5:15 a.m., parked his beat-up Ford pickup in the staff lot, and retrieved his cart from the maintenance building. Same routine, same quiet dignity, same invisible presence that the cadets had learned to step around like furniture. They had no idea they were walking past a man who had single-handedly held off an entire enemy battalion. They couldn't know that the hands now wringing out mop water had once carried 7 injured soldiers to safety through a minefield. They never suspected that the quiet janitor cleaning their toilets was the same man whose actions in Vietnam had saved 119 lives in a single day. Henry worked there because it kept him connected to the military world that had defined his entire adult life, because hearing the sound of marching boots reminded him of better days, because being around young soldiers, even ones who didn't see him, made him feel less alone. Cadet Brandon Mitchell considered himself a natural leader. At 21, he was everything West Point tried to produce: confident, competitive, and completely convinced of his own importance. Like most of his classmates, Brandon barely acknowledged the support staff who kept the academy running. That attitude became clear on a Tuesday morning when Henry was mopping near the library entrance. Brandon and his friends were discussing weekend plans, their voices carrying the easy arrogance of young men who had never been tested. "Check it out," Brandon said, nodding toward Henry. "Pops is really going to town on that floor. Think he's trying to set a new land speed record for slow motion?" His friends chuckled. "I swear he gets slower every week," added David Chen. "At this rate, it's going to take him until Christmas to finish this hallway." "Maybe we should request a younger janitor," suggested Marcus Williams. "Someone who can actually bend over without needing a rest break." They weren't being intentionally cruel. In their minds, they were just making harmless observations about someone who wasn't really part of their world. They had no context for understanding that the man they were mocking had once moved through enemy territory with the silence of smoke and the precision of death itself. Henry heard every word. He always did. But he continued mopping, his movements steady and methodical. He had learned long ago that responding to disrespect only created more problems. "I wonder what his story is," David said. "Think he's a veteran?" "Maybe," Brandon replied dismissively. "Probably some rear echelon guy who never saw action, from filing clerk to floor cleaner. That's what happens when you don't apply yourself." They had no way of knowing that Henry Patterson had volunteered for 3 tours in Vietnam when most soldiers were desperate to avoid even one. They couldn't imagine that the rear echelon guy they were dismissing had earned the Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration. When Brandon called out, "Hey, Pops, you missed a spot over there by the window," Henry looked where he was pointing. The floor was spotless. There was no missed spot. It was just casual humiliation disguised as helpful observation. "Thank you, sir," Henry said quietly. "I'll take care of it." He pushed his cart back to the window and ran his mop over the already clean floor while the cadets watched with amusement, pleased with their demonstration of authority. None of them noticed the way Henry's jaw tightened slightly. None of them saw the brief flash in his eyes, not anger, but sadness. The kind of sadness that comes from being invisible to the very people you once bled to protect. Tuesday, October 15th, 2024, started like every other day. Henry worked methodically through the academic buildings, cleaning classrooms where military strategy was discussed by professors who had never heard bullets whistle overhead. By 10:30 a.m., he had reached the main administrative building. He was cleaning the marble floors of the entrance hall when his keyring, clipped to his belt, somehow came loose. The keys scattered across the polished stone with a metallic clatter that echoed through the space. Henry immediately knelt to collect them, but before he could gather everything, Cadet Michael Torres appeared at his side. "Let me help you with those, sir," Torres said, dropping to one knee beside Henry. Torres was different from many of his classmates. The son of a retired army sergeant, he'd been raised to respect service in all its forms. As he gathered the scattered keys, his fingers closed around something that made him freeze. It was small, star-shaped, suspended from the keyring by a simple chain. At first glance, it looked like any other keychain trinket. But Torres had grown up in a military family. He knew what he was looking at. The Medal of Honor. America's highest military decoration. The medal reserved for acts of valor so extraordinary that they defied belief. The recognition given to fewer than 3,500 people in the entire history of the United States military. "Sir," Torres said quietly, his voice tight with disbelief. Is this real?" Henry looked at the medal in Torres's palm, then slowly raised his eyes to meet the young cadet's gaze. For a moment, neither man spoke. 3 years of carefully maintained invisibility hung in the balance. "Yes," Henry said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's real." Torres felt the world shift around him. Every assumption he had made about the quiet janitor evaporated in an instant. This wasn't just any old man grateful for a job. This was a living legend. "Sir, Torres started, then stopped. "What do you say to someone who has earned the Medal of Honor?" Henry gently took the medal from Torres's hand and clipped it back onto his keyring. "I'd appreciate it if you kept this between us, son. I'm not looking for attention." But Torres couldn't let it go. "Sir, people need to know. The cadets, the faculty, everyone." Henry shook his head. "I'm just the janitor, son. That's all anyone needs to know." "No, sir," Torres said firmly. "You're not just anything. You're a hero." Word spread through West Point like wildfire, not as gossip, but as a sobering realization that would fundamentally change how everyone viewed the quiet man with the mop cart. Within hours, Captain Sarah Mitchell was briefing Colonel Patricia Hayes, the Academy's Commandant of Cadets. "Ma'am, we have a situation," Captain Mitchell began, then explained what Cadet Torres had discovered. Colonel Hayes spent the next 2 hours on secure military databases, cross-referencing personnel records. What she found confirmed the report and added details that made the situation even more extraordinary. Staff Sergeant Henry Patterson had been awarded the Medal of Honor for actions during the Battle of Fire Base Charlie in South Vietnam, March 17, 1971. The citation described how Patterson had single-handedly held off a regiment-sized enemy assault while wounded, allowing his entire company to evacuate safely. He had continued fighting for 6 hours with multiple gunshot wounds, calling in artillery strikes on his own position to prevent enemy overrun. Of the 127 men in his company that day, 119 had made it home alive because of Henry Patterson's actions. Colonel Hayes felt physically ill. They had spent 3 years treating a Medal of Honor recipient like furniture. That afternoon, Henry was escorted to the commandant's office. He still wore his gray coveralls, looking exactly like what everyone had assumed he was, a maintenance worker. Colonel Hayes stood when he entered. "Mr. Patterson, please have a seat. I think we need to have an honest conversation about your background." "Ma'am, I've done my job to the best of my ability." "There's been no problem with your work," Hayes interrupted gently. "The problem is that we've had a Medal of Honor recipient working in our maintenance department for 3 years, and we've treated you like invisible furniture." The silence was profound. Henry's shoulders sagged as 3 years of cover finally collapsed. "Sir, I need you to understand something," Hayes continued. "This institution exists to train future military leaders. Those cadets are studying courage and sacrifice from textbooks. And all this time, a living example has been mopping their floors while they made jokes about him being too slow. Henry looked up, meeting her eyes. "Ma'am, I never wanted special treatment. I just wanted to work." "This isn't about special treatment. This is about basic respect, about making sure our future officers understand what real service looks like." Hayes leaned forward. "Would you be willing to tell me what happened in Vietnam?" Henry was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but distant. "Firebase Charlie was supposed to be routine. 127 men, mostly green troops. I was the senior NCO. We were hit at 0347 hours, 3 regiment-sized assault from 4 directions." He paused, his eyes focusing on something beyond the office walls. "The lieutenant was dead in 5 minutes, both sergeants wounded. That left me with 110 scared kids who had never seen combat. The evacuation helicopters couldn't land under fire. We were on our own." "What did you do?" "What I was trained to do. I organized a fighting withdrawal, got the wounded consolidated, and started calling in artillery support. When the secondary perimeter didn't hold, I sent everyone back to the evacuation point." Henry's voice grew quieter. "Around 0900 hours, it was clear the position would be overrun. The birds needed time to extract the wounded. Someone had to buy them that time." "So you stayed behind?" "I had 1 radio, ammunition, and white phosphorus grenades. I started calling artillery strikes on my own position. Danger close doesn't describe it. I was dropping 155mm shells within 50 meters of where I was laying." Hayes stared at him in amazement. "For 6 hours, I called strikes closer and closer to my position every time they advanced. The white phosphorus was for when they got too close for artillery." Henry rolled up his sleeves, revealing arms covered in white waxy scars. "By the time evacuation was complete, I had 7 bullet wounds and multiple shrapnel injuries." "How did you survive?" "Barely. Rescue found me 12 hours later, unconscious in a crater. Spent 4 months learning to walk again. When they offered to send me home, I requested to return to my unit." "You went back?" "Twice more. Seemed like the right thing to do." Colonel Hayes sat in silence, processing what she had heard. "Mr. Patterson, do you understand what you did that day?" Henry shrugged slightly. "I did my job, ma'am. Took care of my soldiers." "Sir, you single-handedly saved 110 lives. You called artillery on your own position for 6 hours while wounded. You used your body as bait to buy time for evacuation. The helicopters did the real work. I just kept the enemy busy." Hayes realized Henry genuinely didn't understand the magnitude of his actions. To him, it had been simply duty. The next morning, when Henry arrived for his shift, everything was different. As he walked from the parking lot, cadets stopped what they were doing, not to stare, but to acknowledge him with quiet nods of respect. Some saluted. Others stood straighter as he passed. In the buildings, cadets who had previously stepped around him now stepped aside with obvious deference. When he entered classrooms, conversations stopped not from annoyance but from respect. Several cadets approached him quietly to say, "Thank you for your service, sir." The most difficult moment came when he encountered Brandon Mitchell in the hallway. Mitchell stopped and stood at attention. "Sir," Mitchell said, his voice tight with emotion, "I owe you an apology. My behavior has been unacceptable, and I'm ashamed." Henry studied the young cadet's face, seeing genuine remorse. "Son, you didn't know who I was. Can't blame a man for that." "That's just it, sir. I should have treated you with respect regardless. My behavior was wrong because you deserved better as a human being." Henry nodded slowly. "Well then, you've learned something important. That's what matters." He began to push his cart forward, then paused. "Being a leader isn't about having people salute you, son. It's about understanding that everyone you meet is carrying something you can't see. Treat them accordingly." 3 days later, Colonel Hayes received an unexpected request signed by every cadet in the academy, all 4,400 of them. They were asking for Henry Patterson to address the Corps of Cadets as part of their military education. Hayes took the request to Henry personally. The cadets want to learn from someone who has actually lived the principles they're studying. Henry was quiet for a long moment. "Ma'am, I'm not much of a speaker. Most of what happened over there isn't suitable for young folks to hear." "Sir, these aren't young folks. They're future military officers. They need to understand what real leadership looks like under pressure." "Friday afternoon," he said finally. "But I'm not changing out of my work clothes. If they want to hear from the janitor, they can hear from the janitor." Friday afternoon, 4,400 cadets filed into the mess hall in perfect silence. Henry entered through the kitchen, still wearing his gray coveralls. He stood at the front, looking out at the ocean of young faces. "My name is Henry Patterson," he began. "Most of you know me as Pops, the guy who cleans your bathrooms. Some of you think I'm too slow, too old, not worth noticing. You weren't wrong about that. I am old, and I am slow, but I wasn't always either." For the next 30 minutes, Henry told his story. Not the sanitized version from citations, but the real story. The fear, the confusion, the impossible decisions combat demands. "The Medal of Honor citation says I held off a regiment for 6 hours, Henry said near the end. "That makes it sound like I was superhuman, but I was scared every second. The only reason I didn't run was because 110 young soldiers were counting on me." He looked around the room. "You're going to be officers soon. Some will see combat. Remember that courage isn't being fearless. It's being afraid and doing the right thing anyway. Leadership isn't about being toughest or smartest. It's about understanding that your soldiers' lives matter more than your own." The silence was complete. Then one cadet began to clap, then another. Within seconds, the entire corps was on their feet. As Henry headed for the exit, Cadet Torres called out, "Sir, why did you come to work here?" Henry stopped and gave a slight smile. "Because I wanted to be around soldiers again. Reminds me that what we did over there mattered, that the next generation is still willing to serve." He paused, then added, "And because somebody needs to keep your bathrooms clean." The laughter was warm and respectful. 2 years later, Henry Patterson was still at West Point, still arriving before dawn, still performing his duties with meticulous care. His arthritis had worsened, his movements had slowed, but his presence remained a constant reminder of what true service looked like. The cadets who had discovered his identity had graduated and moved on, carrying with them the lessons they had learned. New cadets arrived each year, and each class had to learn for themselves who Henry Patterson was and what he represented. But Henry remained constant, a living reminder that heroes don't always look like heroes, that the most important service is often the least visible, and that dignity is something you carry within yourself regardless of how others choose to see you. The Medal of Honor still hung from his keychain, scratched and worn from years of carrying, a small piece of metal that represented the largest possible measure of human courage. It rode in his pocket as he worked, a reminder not of glory, but of a moment when ordinary became extraordinary through simple human decency. And every morning, as he began his rounds through the academy that had finally learned to see him, Henry Patterson proved once again that the most powerful stories don't need to be told. They just need to be lived. Some heroes carry their medals on their chests, others carry them on their keychains hidden in coverall pockets, visible only to those wise enough to understand that greatness often wears work boots and speaks in whispers. Henry Patterson was both kinds of hero, but he preferred the second kind, because that's the kind that gets the real work done. This story was brought to you by Daily Soldier Stories. Have you ever met someone who carried more than they showed? Someone whose quiet dignity taught you what service really means? Share their story in the comments, and if this story moved you, subscribe to support the channel. We're here to honor the heroes who never asked to be seen, but deserve to be remembered.